First I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Seneca, Wyandot, Shawnee, Mingo, and Delaware nations, and pay my respects to all Native community members, past, present, and emerging, and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and ancestors. I specifically also want to thank Nancy Lensenmayer for making my travel arrangements, particularly texting at midnight last night when my plane was delayed. And I got in at 3 a.m. and I'm on Pacific time, so I apologize for anything that may come out of my mouth that's not intended to. But I also want to thank all of those who I've not met yet who made this event possible and whose labor often goes unnoticed. IT support, Trevor and Andy, wherever you are, thank you very much. Facilities operations, maintenance staff, food services, your work is valued and seen. Thank you. Finally, thank you to Rachel Frick for inviting me to speak as part of this series, and specifically for the diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives here at OCLC. So I met Rachel when she was a program officer at the IMLS, and I was a hopeful grant seeker. The project I was describing to her in 2010 has since grown into the Plateau People's Web Portal and the Mukurtu CMS open software platform that I'll discuss in a bit. But the foundation of these platforms and my work over the last 15 years with Indigenous communities, librarians, archivists, and curators has been to understand, enact, and create just, respectful, and reciprocal relationships in, through, and across networks of difference. So the title of my talk then, We Have Never Been Neutral, Search, Discovery, and the Politics of Access, is meant to foreground this historical landscape upon which the practices of information sharing, management, and circulation take place, and to connect these histories to the political realities of diverse stakeholders, and finally, to open a space to provide a framework for ethical engagements and reciprocal practices within libraries, archives, and museums. So I began by acknowledging the Native communities on whose land we are gathered today, and it is Native dispossession from these lands, as well as continued expressions of Native sovereignty over land, resources, cultural practices, and traditional knowledge that opens my discussion of contemporary practices of collection, search, information freedom, and access. So I'm going to examine how sovereignty has been constructed and is practiced, made public, and put into conversation with current library and archive standards, tools, and policies with an eye towards practical solutions as well as theoretical interventions on multiple registers, from the technological to the social to the political. In April 2016, the Standing Rock Sioux tribal members began protesting the 1,172-mile, four-state Dakota Access Pipeline construction by setting up a small camp along the banks of the Lake Ojai River in North Dakota. By August 2016, what started as a local protest and had largely been ignored by mainstream press grew into an international site of struggle and resistance when the tribe filed suit in federal district court against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency that granted permits needed for the construction of the pipeline. By September, the small Sacred Stone camp swelled to thousands of supporters with over 200 tribes represented to stand together in peaceful protest. Today, Standing Rock reminds us of the direct link to the original dispossession of Native peoples from their traditional homelands. In 1792, then U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson declared that the doctrine of discovery would extend from Europe to the fledgling U.S. government, thereby paving the way for the unseeing of Native peoples across the landscape and the legal fictions that would prop up successive legal policies, including on May 28, 1830, then President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act. In his pleas to Congress earlier that year, he said, quote, "It gives me pleasure to announce to Congress that the benevolent policy of the government, steadily pursued for nearly 30 years, in relation to the removal of the Indians beyond the white settlements is approaching to a happy consummation. It will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. Dispossession, then, was fueled by rhetoric that worked to create a view of Native peoples as savages, on the verge of extinction, destined to the margins of an imagined American nation, allowing for the ensuing violence, reversal of treaties, and attempts at assimilation that remain today, and we saw in Standing Rock. Alongside territorial displacement was the simultaneous attempt to displace the roots of Native traditional knowledge related to the environment, flora, fauna, and cultural practices. In a letter dated August 13th, 1813, to Isaac McPherson, Thomas Jefferson wrote and championed the notion of information freedom when he stated, quote, that ideas should freely spread from one to another over the globe for the moral and mutual instruction of man and improvement of his condition seems to have been peculiarly and benevolently designed by nature when she made them, like fire, expansible over all space, without lessening their density at any point, and like the air in which we breathe, move, and have our physical being, incapable of confinement or exclusive appropriation, end quote. This emphasis by Jefferson on neutrality of knowledge, devoid of social, cultural, or territorial roots, is a crucial factor that oftentimes is overshadowed by the more obvious colonial dispossession of territory. But property rights and what are today our contemporary intellectual property rights regimes were co-produced through and by this attempted erasure of Native territory and the willful not seeing of Indigenous people, lands, knowledge systems, and relationships. The logic of the state then defines and produces the conditions necessary both for a citizenry and territorial boundaries. And it does so, these become normalized, and non-citizens and non-state territories become aberrations within normative structures, defined through absence, discovery, or notions of vanishing races. But long before there was fake news broadcast through bits and bytes over wireless networks, images of bloodless savages needing to be civilized were etched into a national memory in the making, propped up through white privilege and the territorial expansion of a new nation. The practice of documentation across disciplines and government offices served as ideological fuel. Consider, for example, state-sponsored anthropologists taking photographs of Indigenous peoples' rituals or artifacts, and these archival photos become evidence of the supposed savage nature of entire groups, propping up laws that resulted in the removal of Native people from their homelands. Or the botanist, traveling with colonial expeditions, documenting and collecting flora and fauna, along with Indigenous names and traditional ecological knowledge. Now these specimens become modern-day drugs sold by pharmaceutical companies whose profits rise as the landscape is destroyed and Native knowledge is pushed to the side. Or the missionaries, simultaneously documenting Indigenous languages and prohibiting their use by Native children in boarding schools, thus heralding in the loss of what linguists estimate to be thousands of Indigenous languages worldwide. Or the documentation of Native lives through state-required census rolls that form the basis for the removal of children to boarding schools and the allotment of land based on racial categorizations. The claims of Native violence, savagery, and primitivism produced federal Indian policies of dispossession and destruction, created research mandates, and defined generations of collecting practices and documentation tactics that populate the public domain and worked as the fulcrum for the ideological machines of displacement and destruction. As Native legal scholar Angela Riley reminds us, Indian appropriation is the process by which the U.S. legal system has historically facilitated and normalized the taking of all things Indian for others' use, from lands to sacred objects and bodies and identities, end quote. The collection of objects, artifacts, specimens, and detailed records stood in for and sought to mask the violent erasure of languages, lifeways, and landscapes. Collected, collated, and curated for non-Indigenous audience and used to build cases for territorial dispossession and the systematic erasure from a national memory, the documents, maps, ledgers, photos, and ephemera in our modern libraries and archives are both anchors to a colonial past and buoys for a present reconfiguration of history, memory, identity, and sovereignty. So we must be weary, as Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson warns us, of systems that, quote, sustain dispossession and occupation, unquote, and thus maintain colonialism's call. Our libraries, archives, and special collections, in particular, bear witness to this collusion, and this colonial legacy haunts our institutions, and its residue remains through practices based in ahistorical notions of openness and standardization that uphold what archivist Jarrett Drake calls, quote, the delusion of neutrality. Or, as librarian Chris Borg puts it, libraries also fail to achieve any mythical state of neutrality because we contribute to bias and inequality in scholarship and publishing and information access. It is this ideology of neutrality, born from policy and practice and rooted in violent histories of collection, that propagates information freedom as the default within libraries. Going back to Jefferson's quote, this ideal of information, free as the air we breathe, grounds a liberal notion of both access and search. The colonial collecting project was a destructive mechanism by which Indigenous cultural materials were removed from communities and detached from those local knowledge systems. Much of this material remains today, not only physically distant from local communities, but also lodged within information systems that steadfastly refuse local claims to stewardship, whether through a rights field or from marginalization in a notes field. The celebration of information freedom and openness through digital networks has resulted in a limited vocabulary with which to discuss the ethical and cultural parameters of information circulation and access in the digital realm. We have inadvertently recreated the colonial search paradigm that presumes unfettered access and deterritorialized knowledge systems. Here, colonial notions of search and discovery in our current library systems are not mere metaphors. They become the unrecognized ground for policies and practices that shape social, political, and legal decisions and produce more cultural violence and erasure, whereby Ancestry.com can inscribe imperial notions of discovery and uncritical ideals of belonging with their audacious claim that in their archive, one can find an ancestor and gain a nation. In addition to being completely tone deaf to Native American sovereignty and history of genocide, search is reproduced as a privileged act devoid of any social relationship or responsibility. Similarly, if we define our collections as hidden and in need of finding, we erase the systems that presumed them to be hidden and the practices that keep us from seeing the territorial and kin networks from which they have never been lost. We cannot continue to not see the colonial logics underpinning these practices and the simultaneous capitalist assumptions that quantify these cultural materials as products and measure our interactions with them by clicks per page. These seemingly benign processes and workflows erase the personal, political, affective, traumatic, and the intimate. But if we move away from this scaffolding, we can move towards building new structures that reframe access as accountability. Discovery becomes reciprocity, and search becomes engagements. So what I'm suggesting is that these new modes are framed by a decolonization of library practices, grounded within Indigenous sovereignty Indigenous communities have shown that there are many threads of sovereignty that are woven together. Native legal scholars Wallace Coffey and Rebecca Tsutsi suggest that any account of inherent sovereignty should embody cultural sovereignty. That is, the effort of Indian nations and Indian people to exercise their own norms and values in structuring their collective futures. Similarly, Winona Single argues that, quote, cultural sovereignty refers to tribes' efforts to represent their histories and existence using their own terms, and it acknowledges that each Indian nation has its own vision of self-determination as shaped by each tribe's culture, history, traditions, and practices, end quote. So for libraries and archives, this means a recognition that the materials in our care are cultural, social, political, relational belongings, and that they're fragile. And I don't mean physically fragile, although they might be. I mean ideologically fragile. That is, easily and often unconsciously manipulated to uphold structures of domination and dispossession. So we must take care. And models already exist for undoing these systems and reframing them within Indigenous experiences and systems. For example, the Musqueam Indian Band, Vancouver, Canada, their online place name archive and exhibit requires visitors to accept their terms for viewing Musqueam places and hearing Musqueam stories in the Hunkaminam language. Only upon accepting these terms, which include, quote, being respectful and not reproducing any portion of the site without permission, can one enter and view some of the content, videos, maps, and hear the language. Where access in standard archival practice is based on a researcher's status, donor regulations, or a depoliticized notion of open access and the public good, here access is predicated on respectful action, urging us to be part of a social system built on the connections between places, language, and deep histories of belonging. Similarly, the Blackfoot People's Blackfoot Digital Library has a terms of service and condition for use that include a statement on knowledge acquisition and use that states, quote, you are not considered a member of any Blackfoot tribe, nor are you considered a shaman or medicine person because you learned something on this site. This site is not for recreating Blackfoot ceremony by non-Blackfoot people, end quote. Turning the standard terms of service on its side, the Blackfoot terms of service asks viewers to act responsibly and to understand that access does not equate to ownership of knowledge or identity, that belonging to a community is not a legal status, but a social responsibility. Similarly, in the Inland Pacific Northwest, at the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture, their native plateau collections are kept separate in a sacred room, restricted from the general public, but accessible to plateau community members. Here, colonial collecting spaces are turned around to respect Indigenous systems of care and stewardship. Across Aboriginal Australia, practices of masking, deleting, defaming, and hiding images, objects, and artifacts are quite common after someone has passed away, and images are not revealed again, the family decides it's time. So all of these examples demonstrate the very tactile, material, embodied practices of cultural sovereignty, expressions of knowledge circulation, and social protocols for access and search around cultural materials and knowledge. I was first introduced to these grounded, relationship-based information systems in my collaborations with the Warramungu Aboriginal community in Central Australia, where I began working in 1995 as a graduate student. Like most Indigenous communities, the Warramungu have several protocols for how knowledge should circulate, be managed and accessed by various stakeholders within the community. So for example, some songs may only be accessible and sung by women of a certain age, initiated into a certain ritual knowledge, or from a certain place. Or it may be that elders may have access to certain places on the landscapes that also gives them access to knowledge and the ability to pass that on. So in all cases, though, factors such as age, gender, country, physical places on the landscape, kinship, and so on, all combine in various ways to produce these protocols at a very granular level for seeing, hearing, and acting responsibly. Today, digital content is no different. After a trip to the National Archives in Darwin in 2002 with several community members, we returned to Tennant Creek with hundreds of digital documents, all loaded onto my MacBook. And they were quickly interpreted through Warramungu systems of acknowledgement. Michael Jumbin Jones, sitting next to a 2002 version of me there, and other communities were distressed that images of deceased relatives, names of sacred sites, and documents containing ritual practices were available and displayed to the public, blatantly disregarding Warramungu protocols. So Jumbin wanted to create a community digital archive that provided what he called proper circulation, display, and sharing of cultural materials and knowledge. He named the archive that he imagined Mukadu. In the Warramungu language, Mukadu literally means dilly bag. And elders keep sacred materials in the dilly bag. And younger generations have to approach and ask permission to be able to learn. But as Jumbin said, elders can't be stingy. They have to open up. They have to teach and share. But it's a set of relationships. It's an intergenerational transmission of knowledge that's built and sustained through community interactions. So as Jumbin elaborated, he said, Mukadu is like a safe keeping place. And this became the basis for the design and structure of the original Mukadu Wumparani Kari archive that we built and launched in 2002. In the archive, every item is tagged with what we call sharing protocols that allow for granular levels of access that mirror those offline relationships. So every piece of content is tagged. Does it have a gender protocol? Is it for elders only? Which family and which countries are related to this? And then each community member has a profile associated with those same sets of protocols. So whereby when they log in, the database pulls only material that they are related to and have obligations to care for. They won't see other things. So it was this basis of embedded protocols and local knowledge systems that we used to engage with Indigenous communities around the world. We knew a one-size-fits-all software design model wouldn't work. We needed to create something with the flexibility to be able to accommodate Indigenous communities from Oklahoma to the Outback, and also non-Indigenous institutions, large federal repositories, local libraries, state historical agencies with Native collections. 8 years of community software development, generously funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the NEH. We wouldn't be here today without them, so go IMLS and NEH. Now we have Mukadu CMS, a free and open source content management system and community digital archive platform built from the ground up with this mandate for a safe keeping place. The idea that there are ethical ways of relating to tangible and intangible forms of knowledge grounded in physical places, relationships, and enduring social systems. Today, and I'm skipping over obviously a lot of software development that I'm happy to talk about at another time, but today Mukadu CMS is at a 2.07 release, and it allows for local protocol-driven access and circulation of content and metadata defined by each community who has an instance. Multiple layers of community narration, records, and attribution. And it is completely configurable and customizable to the cultural, social, and importantly, linguistic needs of any size community, culture center, library, archive, and museum. We have over 250 users of Mukadu presently worldwide that we know of. And alongside Mukadu and growing from our first 3 years of work with communities to implement the platform is the Local Context Initiative. a platform that my colleague Jane Anderson at New York University and I designed to provide information about and solutions for the specific complications faced by Indigenous peoples seeking to manage, share, and steward their digital cultural heritage materials. These grew out of our early experiences with Mukurtu, where communities did not have the rights to the materials that they wanted to share, the Western legal rights. They had their own rights. So inspired by Creative Commons licenses that purposely disrupt the models of circulation and access within traditional copyright, they are an extension of existing contract law, and they clearly mark additional ways content can be used. So Creative Commons licenses are great if you're a copyright holder. If not, you're screwed. So, that's live, I'm sorry. You don't have a lot of options. So the legacies of colonial collection and research mean that Indigenous communities today, under Western legal regimes born from those earlier practices I already described, they don't own or hold copyright to much of their cultural heritage. Instead, a majority of the material is either in the public domain, and it got there by violent and dubious means, or it's owned by third parties, scholars, libraries, museums, collecting institutions. So we had to move away from licenses for now. Our long-term goal with the Local Context Initiative is to change the international intellectual property rights regime. That may take us a while. So for now, we were inspired by fair trade labels that provide a model for labeling. So we've spent the last 4 years actively developing a set of traditional knowledge labels that deal specifically with digital cultural heritage materials circulating in the context of collecting institutions, libraries, archives, and museums. So TK labels are an educational and social intervention. They give Indigenous communities a way to add additional information to already public materials in order to educate others about the proper use and access parameters of those materials. So much like fair trade labels, TK labels provide that additional information so that people can make informed, ethical decisions about their use, reuse, and circulation. So I am not against remix, I'm for responsible remix. So for example, a seasonal label allows communities to tell others that these materials are generally only seen or heard during certain seasons. So for example, we work with the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. They have a set of songs that should only be heard after the first snow falls. This label can designate that. As a listener, you can choose to respect that. Or the attribution label allows communities to clearly designate that they are the traditional knowledge holders of the content and should be attributed as such, regardless of what the Western copyright says. So the TK labels are embedded in Mukurtu as part of our Mukurtu core metadata fields. Any instance of Mukurtu then is structured around what we lovingly call Mukurtu's 3 C's: communities, cultural protocols, and categories. All content and metadata are filtered and grounded through these. Communities, the who of Mukurtu, the stakeholder and the contributors to the site. Again, we're grounding it in that notion of the socialness of these materials. So who? And then cultural protocols, the how of Mukurtu. How should content and metadata be shared and accessed? And then categories, the what of Mukurtu. What are the vocabularies most meaningful to the communities engaging with that content? They define the categories within their own instances of Mukurtu. So with this as the base for any site when you set it up, we then get to the content level information. Mukurtu has 5 sets of metadata tabs that allow for a rich narration and diverse sets of information, and it all begins with our Mukurtu required and Mukurtu core fields. And these include communities and protocols for every item. But you have across the 5 tabs, the final tab, the additional metadata is actually just your Dublin core. So we've extended that with our Mukurtu Essentials, Mukurtu core, then you get down to the sort of standards that you might be familiar with. So this all comes together in local uses of Mukurtu CMS in diverse ways. So for example, The Musqueam Indian Band in Vancouver are using Mukurtu to create a virtual exhibit of Musqueam public art around the city of Vancouver called A Time for Mutual Understanding, to educate the non-native public about their art and knowledge and its connection to the city. They've used our collections feature to group content, and they added artist bio pages and an interactive map that they overlaid with Musqueam names around the city. The art itself is viewable by the public, while the traditional knowledge and community narratives of the art is viewable through protocols only to community members. They've also used the collection page feature to highlight each artist individually, pulling content from across the site. Allows them to order content in any way and add summaries and pertinent information. The artist bios have a short introduction written by the artist and then a list of all their artwork to highlight the individual artist's work and thus undo that erasure of named Musqueam people from the cityscape. One of the largest Mukurtu CMS sites to date is the Mira Canning Stock Route project in Western Australia, with over 40,000 items to date from Aboriginal communities and art centers up and down the Colonial Stock Route. The materials re-narrate that fraught colonial history through contemporary Aboriginal artwork, oral histories, and videos, many in their own languages, at the sites from which they were removed by the government. So each art center is a community in Mukurtu's terms, and they define their protocols for access and use of each individual item. So here, for example, we see the designation of public access. This is key for Mukurtu. Within Mukurtu CMS, there is no default access. All types of access are defined. Public is not a default. Public is one type of access. It's not neutral and it's not given. This is where Mukurtu's architecture lays bare assumptions that may be taken for granted in other systems that default to open and ask others to make them closed. Similarly, for multi-page items, we've created an image viewer in Mukurtu so that community managers can add unique metadata and protocols for every page. So as I said, we've had a community software development model. All of our features and functions come from communities asking for them. And this was a key one for communities because in this example of this scrapbook for example, from a boarding school, there are going to be many different stories and people and knowledge on every page. So every page has to have the ability to have unique metadata and a protocol. In the Plateau People's web portal that I direct at WSU, we've used Mukurtu as our platform to create the collaboratively curated and reciprocally managed digital archive in collaboration with 8 Plateau tribal nations in the Quad State region. Importantly, we started this collaboration by signing a memorandum of understanding with the tribal nations involved that was already based on an overarching MOU that Washington State University has with 12 tribal nations in the region. We also have a Native American advisory board to the president that oversees these interactions. So MOUs are a very productive instrument for redressing previous collection and curation policies. They set about a new relationship at that government-to-government level that fundamentally begins with Native sovereignty. As a state institution and as a state employee, we only work on government-to-government level. So for the portal, this meant that each tribal nation has their own tribal path. So while you can search throughout the whole portal, you can also enter any particular path, a community within Mukurtu's terminology. And the tribal administrators manage and curate content that is related to them, not WSU staff. And they decide to share content across communities as they choose. So importantly, our workflow is defined by a collaborative curation model that begins with tribal members selecting materials to be digitized from local, national, and regional archives. We do not digitize or display any content without approval. The reliance on takedown notices that some institutions or platforms use replays the cultural violence of the original physical dispossession of those materials. I can't stress that enough. Once selected and digitized, the communities provide metadata for the items, and this begins with choosing categories. There are 12 categories in the portal, again, chosen and defined by the tribal representatives, added over 3 years. The significance here is that we do not default to any controlled vocabularies or default to Library of Congress subject headings, because we know that they have often been hostile to Indigenous ways of knowing and describing. And there's been a significant amount of scholarship around the problematic nature of subject headings for almost 40 years. I recommend the 2015 Cataloging and Classification Quarterly Special Issue on Indigenous Knowledge if you're interested in that. So all categories are flexible and customizable in any Mukurtu site. And then keywords are used more like tags and can be added on the fly by users to aid search and browsing. So it all comes together looking at a display page to see. In Mukurtu, any type of material is defined as a digital heritage item. We move away from those notions of individual isolated records and instead see cultural materials as sets of overlapping narratives and histories. Mukurtu then allows multiple media items, records, and metadata for any DH item. Here's a root gathering bag chosen by the Warm Springs tribe from the collections of the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture. So we can see at the top, the tab denotes the museum record. And you can see the institutional metadata to the right and a pretty standard museum description of the object, round, twine, cylindrical, corn husk bag. Through community curation with Warm Springs community members, they added their own record, we see as we tab across the top of the page. In the Warm Springs community record, we now have the proper title, Duck Basket. We have a protocol for access, in this case, public access, or I wouldn't be showing it to you. I wouldn't actually see it. Within Mukurtu, that's another thing. If there are protocols for access, you just don't know it's there, you don't see it. It's not that you get a restricted access, you don't know it's there. And a traditional knowledge label that you see here, in this case, attributing it specifically to the Wasco basket makers. And then in Mukurtu are unique fields for cultural narrative and traditional knowledge. These fields have been updated now, and they allow for any file format, audio, video, or text, to bring alive that traditional knowledge or cultural narratives.
Yeah, to me, this looks like a legend on this bag. After you look at it and see that this is Spiliai for legendary, then the khat, the ducks. Back in those days, you know, the people themselves argued over how the duck made its sound. And he says, no, it goes like this. The other one says, chow, no, it goes like this. And Coyote was listening to them. Pretty soon they separated. They got the people divided up because the ones that agreed this is the way the duck makes a sound, and the others said, no, it's this way. So they divided up and left. One lived somewhere else.
My grandpa used to say that one of these days I know I'm going to go north and I'm going to hear Wasco people talking, and it'll be our long lost relatives.
See, here they are talking.
Yeah.
They're talking.
That's you need to take a picture and tell a story with that.
So the duck basket comes to life, and we no longer only see a round, twine, cylindrical corn husk bag. We know the story of its creation. We heard the language, the sounds of the ducks, traditional cultural knowledge, family histories, and tribal histories all in one place. Similarly, a set of lantern slides in WSU's special collections that had little or no metadata and very well could have been determined a hidden collection, as we quite literally found them on a shelf in the basement. from the Chemawa boarding school, which held Native children from across the country. We see the university record with its description of the photographic slide, the inside of the bakery at Chemawa. Because our policy is not, however, to digitize anything without permission, even though to many in the library these seem to be benign. But we collaborated for over a year with 3 communities whose children have been taken to Chemawa as part of federal Indian policies. And now we have multiple records for several tribes and individual community members, 4 records to date. And importantly, each record can have its own protocol for access. Mukudu's emphasis at this structural level on multivocality undoes the notion of an expert, detached, neutral set of facts and moves us to see the richness of including diverse sets of knowledge for undoing the cultural violence. In the Umatilla record, we have a narrative from Percy Bingham, now an elder, who lived at the Chemawa boarding school in his youth.
Chemawa was, well, for breakfast, twice a week we'd have cornmeal mush. And there'd be big worms in that mush, and if you didn't set that damn worm aside and eat that mush, you didn't get any more. That was it.
From Percy's words, the cold black and white photo of the boarding school bakery is brought to life through his story of the everyday cultural violences of boarding schools, having to eat the worm in the porridge to survive. We can feel the effects of the Indian policies of removal. Upending these sterile descriptions, most archival records contain that flatten responses and elevate disinterested narratives. The intertwined and layered metadata fields in Mukudu invite affect and expressions of relation with and through the overlaid model and workflow of collaborative curation. The tool itself cannot do it. Mukudu, of course, is a tool. It's a platform. We have designated it to forefront the standards I began with: accountability, reciprocity, and engagement. Over the last 3 years, we've worked to implement this same model at the federal level. The last 3 years, Jane Anderson and I have worked as part of the Ancestral Voices Project, a collaboration between the Passamaquoddy Nation, the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, Washington State University, and New York University. In 2011, under the directive of the Librarian of Congress, the American Folklife Center purposely set out to preserve and provide access to some of the earliest and most rare audio collections that they had, these wax cylinder recordings. Specifically, we focused on the 1890 recordings of anthropologist Jesse Walter Fuchs. Fuchs set out in 1890 to test Thomas Alva Edison's cylinder phonographic recorder in Calais, Maine, with the Passamaquoddy, prior to heading to the Southwest as part of a larger salvage mission to document fading and supposedly dying languages and cultures. So at the same time as the government was advancing an Indian policy built on displacement and destruction, technologists were building recording devices to preserve those languages and cultures they sought to destroy. This perverse set of practices led to thousands of wax cylinder recordings now in the Library of Congress and the first native languages recorded in the United States. So after 126 years, the Library of Congress was able to use a new tool called the Archaeophone to extract audio content from the wax cylinders and convert it directly to digital audio. The 31 digital files extracted hold rich stories, narratives, songs, and the Passamaquoddy language from Fuchs' original 1890 sessions. But instead of putting the recordings online or making them available for scholars and researchers in their reading room, we've worked together over the last year with the Passamaquoddy community, taking the recordings to them to have listening sessions on their land, in their territory, a key recognition of their sovereignty. And importantly, we left the recordings there, and the community has had their own listening sessions with the returned audio. During our first session last April, we gathered with the Passamaquoddy language teachers, the preschool immersion class, and elders to have a first listen to the cleaned up audio files. Here's a little snippet from the audio file. So that may sound distorted to you, and it certainly did to my ear. But as we played it again and we started listening, quickly listening became singing by Gracie Davis, and then another, and then another. Since that first listening session, community members have isolated words, phrases, and beats that they're using in language classes, and younger kids who don't speak the language are using the beats to create new songs. We also know from community consultation that a portion of those 31 cylinders contain culturally sensitive materials, songs and stories collected and recorded by Fuchs, but never meant for public consumption or circulation. For this project then, the Passamaquoddy Nation have crafted TK labels to be attached to the updated records in the Library of Congress's online catalog system. Here is the previous record that up until 3 weeks ago was online at the AFC site. The title, Passamaquoddy War Song, Trading Song. The rights field, quote, rights are held by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, Harvard University. Now, as of 3 weeks ago, the record reads, Passamaquoddy name for trading song in their language. I'm not going to try to say it because I don't want to get it wrong. And importantly, the rights field now has 3 TK labels, attribution, non-commercial, and outreach, listed first, and the Peabody Museum listed second. For those of you interested, the MARC record, the field for TK labels that the AFC is using is 856. I've never showed this slide before, but I thought y'all might be interested. I know these things are important. And I want to thank the amazingly fantastic metadata librarian at the AFC, Maggie Crucy, for doing all this work. God knows, metadata librarians, you're special people. I really like you. But this is important because it goes back to that structural level, right? So what MARC field, when other institutions go to do this, you need to know. So the complete public-facing record is not viewable yet. It will be later this summer on the AFC site. We do have from our consultations, though, with the Passamaquoddy, custom label text that will go live this summer. They are in the Passamaquoddy Mukadu site, so we can see their customized labels. Attribution, translated into the Passamaquoddy language, and then in English. This is how it is done. This is the right way. Non-commercial, this is not to be purchased. And outreach, this is a teaching tool. You learn from this. All of the labels within Mukadu can be customized by any community using them. So taken together, these are a set of examples of differing scales of intervention that seek to upend and disrupt the legacies of collecting and looking, provocatively illustrated here by Native artist Zig Jackson's photograph, Shooting Them, Shooting Us, poignantly showing the pushback and response to these systems. So to begin decolonizing libraries and archives, to undo the territorial and cultural dispossessions upon which they are built, We must start by changing the structures we have at all levels to reflect accountability, engagement, and reciprocity. And there are steps we can do to take this process that you can do. Create MOUs at an institutional level with Native nations as part of your institution's collections and research policies. These are fundamental as they begin from a point of nation-to-nation agreements, and they embed your collections and research policies in the sovereignty of the nations. Add steps to your workflows around metadata creation that account for multiple voices in your collections. Please don't relegate these to the notes field. Update your access policies to reflect support for varied access parameters based on cultural sovereignty and histories of erasure. Work with Indigenous stakeholders to add TK labels to public domain materials. And also lobby for other content management systems to include a TK label field. There are other content management systems, some that you might be aware of. I'll just leave that there. These are practical steps that reflect structural changes that undo the reliance on the default notion of neutrality. They will not be quick. They will be time-consuming. And this is the point. Making systemic change is a slow process, but it is one that brings us to the humanistic endeavor that libraries and archives can create. One that values meaningful engagements over products, whereby we create relationships, not records. Thank you.